Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Liberty Station, San Diego, October 13th, 2014, early evening. Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan, 31, a Navy spouse and mother of two, stops replying to texts. The everyday pings and check-ins that frame a family's routine fall quiet. Within minutes, the digital trail that usually defines a normal night goes still. In quiet neighborhoods, silence isn't absence, it's evidence. This is the opening frame of a case that will be classified as a crime only much later, but the clock starts right here. We lock to what's verifiable. Elizabeth is last known to be at or near her residence in Point Loma's Liberty Station corridor on October 13th. Communications cease later that day. No late-night messages to friends. No, I'm running out for a minute. No banking activity that suggests an impulsive trip. That gap isn't dramatic writing. It's a measurable signal. Detectives will later refer to this kind of digital dark as a negative data point, the thing that should be present but isn't. By the next day, October 14th, concern has moved from family circles to official channels. A friend, importantly not the spouse, initiates the missing person report with San Diego police. Patrol officers treat the intake as they should, like any adult disappearance with unknown foul play. No sirens, no crime scene tape, no immediate declaration of a homicide. You start with time, place, and last reliable observations. That's the rule. Officers conduct welfare checks at the residence. They talk to immediate neighbors. They note vehicles present, lighting, doors and windows, and anything that looks out of place but not obviously forced. If a residence was tidied earlier, that's not proof of anything by itself. It's logged and compared later. What matters is establishing a baseline so that any change, big or small, can be read against the clock that began the previous evening. The first hours lean heavily on routine. Confirm Elizabeth's identifiers, gather recent photos, verify the phone number tied to her device, and request recent call and text activity through standard channels. In 2014, investigators don't have the modern app telemetry you might expect today. They're looking at carrier logs, not the inside of third-party apps. That constraint matters because it keeps the picture clean. What exists are calls and texts, and what does not exist after October 13th is just as important. At the house, initial responders do not designate a homicide scene. That distinction is critical for you as a viewer. It's not that there is no scene, it's that there is no homicide designation yet. The difference prevents the kind of contradiction that confuses audiences later on. Early checks confirm the children's whereabouts and immediate safety. Officers ask standardized questions. When was Elizabeth last seen? What was she wearing? Did she mention travel? Were any belongings obviously missing? Wallet, keys, medications? The answers supply a narrow window that anchors the timeline for detectives and, eventually, for a jury. Canvas work begins in a tight radius. In a neighborhood like Liberty Station, walkable streets, mixed residential near the bay, officers know which storefronts keep cameras, which homes traditionally cooperate, and which corners offer the best views of ingress and egress. They request that recordings be preserved before they auto-overwrite. They flag the shoreline and nearby footpaths for quick visual checks. You don't mount a full-scale search off a thin lead, but you don't let the tide erase potential context either. If a camera points the wrong way or didn't capture the window, that's logged too. Absence is data. Meanwhile, the missing person entry pushes out through official channels. Detectives reach out to Elizabeth's known contacts and immediate family for last contact times, tone of recent conversations, and any friction points that would explain a voluntary break. Investigators don't decide motive in the first 24 hours. They build a timeline that can support or refute any later claim. If someone later says, "She walked away," this first chapter will be used to test that. If someone speculates about conflict at home, these early statements will either line up with the record or they won't. For the audience, here's the working picture. A 31-year-old mother goes silent. Her phone does too. A friend goes to police on October 14th. The residence is seen by patrol and preserved for follow-up. The neighborhood is canvassed. Nothing yet qualifies as a homicide scene. You are not missing a twist. The case is not being coy. This is how a real investigation opens, deliberate, chronological, restrained. There's one more practical point that keeps this story coherent later. The difference between what's found early and what's proven later. We will not preview later forensic findings here. We will not relitigate early steps once the medical examiner speaks. Each chapter in this series adds a distinct investigative layer: morgue, scene processing, digital movement, interviews, procurement, charging, admissibility, trial, without replaying the same piece with different adjectives. That structure keeps the narrative intact and the facts clean. Retention-wise, you should be asking the right question already. If this were a voluntary disappearance, why is there no traceable digital life after October 13th? A phone can be turned off, a line can go quiet, but in 2014, most daily routines leave small signatures, missed calls, attempted texts, banking checks, even a quick search. When none of that shows up, investigators notice the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. We close the first chapter where investigators do in real life, with a time-stamped gap that is bigger than it looks. The story will not pivot to speculation. It will pivot to the next domain that can answer what happened: medical facts. The case now moves from patrol notes to medical facts. The remains recovered from San Diego Bay are transported under seal to the medical examiner. A unique case number is assigned, seals are logged, and every handoff is signed: driver to intake, intake to morgue tech to the forensic pathologist. Photographs are taken before any cleaning. Clothing and any adhered material are separated, dried, and packaged. This is where the investigation stops asking what people think happened and starts documenting what the body can prove. Identification is handled first. Radiographs and dental charting are compared against known records associated with Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan, 31. In a case with marine exposure and elapsed time, dental comparison provides speed and reliability. When a match is established, it becomes the anchor point for the rest of the file. The missing person entry and the homicide file now refer to the same individual. Notifications are recorded in the chain of custody log. Those moments are procedural, not dramatic, but they keep the case admissible. The external exam documents condition after recovery: clothing status, bindings, if any, jewelry, scars, prior medical interventions. Marine activity and time can obscure soft tissue detail. The report reflects what is observable, not what is imagined. The pathologist notes sharp force trauma consistent with multiple stab wounds. Fractures of the jaw and nasal bones are recorded. Rib injury is also documented. Wound tracks are mapped with rods and photographed with scale. Because of decomposition, some margins are estimated rather than exact, and that limitation is written into the report so no one overstates certainty later. The internal exam follows a standard sequence: cranial, thoracic, abdominal, while preserving any trace evidence that might survive in protected areas, under folds, within clothing cavities, or embedded near wound paths. Samples are retained for histology, even if tissue architecture is degraded. Fluids for toxicology are collected if available. In water-exposed remains, femoral blood may be limited or unavailable, so the team pivots to vitreous humor or alternative matrices as feasible. No one promises what tox will show before the lab results. The file only reflects confirmed outcomes. Cause and manner are separated on purpose. The cause is rooted in injury, sharp force trauma with associated skeletal fractures. The manner is homicide. The report avoids narrative beyond what the body supports. There is no speculation about location of assault, means of transport, or storage. Those belong to later chapters when physical scene work and timeline evidence can be layered in. The medical examiner's role is narrower, and, for that reason, more authoritative. With the identification and primary findings signed, the body is now recognized as the central scene. Fingernails are clipped and bagged if intact. Any hairs or fibers trapped in seams are lifted. The clothing is documented by brand, size, and unique features. Labels and stitching sometimes matter later when surveillance footage needs garment matching. If trace materials are recovered, they are sealed and sent to the crime lab with discrete submission numbers to keep testing lines clean. Nothing about this stage is speculative. Each item either exists and is labeled or it does not. Timing is handled carefully. Post-mortem interval in marine settings is imprecise. Currents, temperature, and bioactivity create wide ranges. The pathologist states those limitations. The absence of a precise interval does not weaken the value of the injuries themselves. In practice, jurors and judges take the cause and manner first, then weigh timing with the help of investigators and expert testimony later. A short note on perspective. In coastal cities like San Diego, water preserves some evidence and erases other kinds. That is not a flourish, it's a working constraint. The team compensates by locking down what can still be measured: injury type, injury count, and compatibility with specific classes of weapons. If a blade class can be inferred from wound geometry, that inference is stated with its limits. If it cannot, the report says so. Precision builds credibility. From a human standpoint, this chapter is about giving a name back to a person who was missing for 2 years and converting speculation into measurable fact. The medical examiner's signature is not the end of the story. It is the first stable footing. With cause and manner formalized, detectives have legal footing to reapproach the Liberty Station residence not as a welfare check but as a potential assault site. The next steps will look for scene-level evidence that matches these injuries and for tools that match these wound profiles. The data align too cleanly in silence. Now it begins to align in fractures and wound paths. The medical findings give investigators the legal footing to return to Liberty Station with warrants and a homicide lens. Entry is controlled. Body cameras on. Scene log started. A single path in and out. The address isn't taped off for spectacle. It's managed for integrity. Rooms are photographed in sequence before anyone moves an object. Lights are dim for an alternate light source sweep. Then luminol is used where patterns suggest it might matter. What was a welfare check a year earlier is now treated as a potential assault site. In the primary bedroom, technicians cut a discrete square of carpet at a discoloration that's nearly invisible in normal light. Beneath the fiber, the padding shows a clearer stain. Beneath the padding, the plywood carries a deeper imprint that follows gravity rather than footsteps. Each layer is bagged, labeled, and sealed with a unique number. This is not about drama. It's about demonstrating that a liquid traveled downward in a way everyday spills do not. A control sample from a clean section of floor goes into its own envelope so the lab can measure the difference. The attic receives the same slow approach. Insulation is peeled back in a grid so nothing is missed. A folding knife is found tucked above a joist, out of ordinary reach, away from any tool buckets. It is photographed in place with scale, then lifted by the textured portion of the handle to avoid smearing. A presumptive test on the blade shows a positive reaction consistent with blood. The knife is packaged in a vented container to prevent corrosion before the full lab workup. Property receipt, initials, time. Every step is written down because every step will be questioned. Neighbor footage is canvassed again, but now with a tighter request window built from the digital shutdown that started October 13th. One camera catches a vehicle, nose pointed slightly off axis in a way the owner says is unusual. Another records lights toggling at a time the household routine wouldn't explain. None of this proves a theory by itself. It simply frames how movement and placement deviate from normal, which is what juries expect to see. Not a story, a pattern. Inside the home, there are no splashes on the walls, no dramatic wipe marks that look like television. There is, however, a vertical path in the floor stack that pairs logically with the injuries documented at the morgue without restating them. A lab will confirm whether the material in that path is Elizabeth's blood. If it is, the house becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes the probable location of injury. Chain of custody forms stack up. Carpet square, padding, subfloor cut, control piece, knife, swabs from the handle and blade, latent lift cards from the attic joists, and a dust sample near the placement. The point is not volume, it is clarity. Each item answers a narrow question. Is this Elizabeth's blood? Is this a mixed DNA profile? Was this knife ever in contact with her? And if so, could it have caused the wounds described by the medical examiner? There's a human reality under the paperwork. Homes are where families feel safest. When investigators take them apart, even carefully, there's a cost. But accuracy matters more than speed. If you rush here, you lose later. With the bedroom and attic now documented, attention shifts to what the clocks can prove. Carrier legal requests go out first. Analysts pull call and text logs tied to Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan's number and confirm the window already suspected from interviews. Normal activity through October 13, 2014, then a full stop later that night. No outgoing calls, no texts that land, no incoming communications answered. In 2014, this kind of review means carrier records and basic tower interaction, not app telemetry or GPS trails. If a handset is powered down or placed in airplane mode, the network sees silence. Here, silence is exactly what appears, and it persists into the following morning. Investigators pair that negative window with delivery data from contacts. Friends who text after the evening cutoff see messages stay undelivered or never receive the usual read or response. That corroborates the carrier pull without speculating about motive. It also fixes a starting point for all subsequent requests, camera preservation, retail logs, and any device returns from the home that may later be imaged by the lab under a separate warrant. Camera canvas returns with mixed results, which is typical for a coastal residential grid. Some devices overwrote within days, but a few retained enough to bracket movement near Liberty Station around the same period that the phone goes dark. One driveway unit records headlight wash and a brief shadow crossing a curb line during a window that matters. Another shows a vehicle oriented slightly off-angle to the usual parking habit already noted by patrol. Useful not because it proves a narrative, but because it narrows when something deviated from routine. Analysts log exact time codes and export the clips with chain of custody notations so later use in court cannot be challenged. Financials come next. Subpoenaed statements anchor a retail purchase on October 14th, a carpet cleaning product bought locally and time-stamped within roughly 24 hours of the communications cutoff. On its own, a purchase like that can be routine. In context, it becomes a marker that investigators can place on the same axis as the phone silence and the camera windows. The receipt image, if available, is copied and sealed. If only the transaction line appears, the timestamp and terminal ID are preserved so a store video pull can be targeted. The point is not drama, it is alignment. The home router, if present and legally obtained, is examined for lease events around the same time period. In many households in 2014, logs are sparse and retention limited. When entries exist, they are compared against expected device MAC addresses. A router log that shows nothing unusual doesn't negate the pattern, it simply limits what can be asserted. That restraint matters for trial. Analysts also check for repeated voicemail pings or message waiting status changes that sometimes show up on carrier records even when a line is powered down. In this file, the absence of such artifacts supports the observation that the device did not rejoin the network after the evening of October 13th. That negative evidence, no phone activity, is treated as a defined interval rather than a loose impression. When the chart is built, it reads as a continuous bar of silence. To keep the narrative coherent, investigators resist the urge to stack unverified digital rumor on top of verified records. They do not infer travel from the lack of activity. They do not assign intent to a retail line. They stage their asks, carrier, cameras, point of sale, and, if warranted later, any third-party cloud backups recovered via separate legal process. The process is dull by design and persuasive for the same reason. Each slice confirms only what it can confirm. This ends with a simple overlay. On one track, last known phone and text activity on October 13th, then nothing. On a parallel track, camera snips that frame deviation near the residence. On a third, a purchase the next day that may or may not be related, but now has a place on the grid. The alignment is not a conclusion. It is a map that will be tested by statements in the next phase. The lab cues are running. Now investigators turn to what people said when the hours were fresh and what they said after the shoreline identification, comparing both sets against the fixed digital and forensic clocks. Friends describe Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan as stretched thin but functioning, caring for two small children, exploring separation options, and seeking advice about next steps. Several note specific dates near October 2014 when she discussed housing, custody, and finances in practical terms. None report a plan to vanish or travel without notice. Those contacts tried to reach her later that night and into the next morning. Messages stayed unanswered. That silence matches the carrier pull already in the file. It is recorded as corroboration, not commentary. Close acquaintances recall tension inside the Liberty Station home, arguments about money, schedules, and the uncertainty that comes before a formal split. Investigators capture those statements in clean, time-stamped interviews. The point isn't to assign character, it's to determine whether a voluntary walkout fits the logs. When an adult chooses to leave, there is usually a short burst of activity. A final text, a ride request, a withdrawal, or at least a call to someone who will be asked to keep it quiet. None of those artifacts appear after October 13th. The spouse's early account is that Elizabeth left on her own. Detectives record it precisely, when that claim was made, the exact wording, and any details that could be verified. The walked-away statement is tested against the negative digital interval and the later scene findings without argument. Did she take a wallet, keys, a bag consistent with leaving for a night or longer. What items were missing becomes a checklist. What remains in place becomes another. Later, as the homicide posture sets, a second round of questions addresses specifics. What hours the spouse says he slept, which television shows played in the background, whether anyone else stopped by the residence, whether any vehicles moved, and when. Each line is then placed against the camera time codes and the retail timestamp on October 14th. A defense theme emerges early through counsel. Elizabeth had a history of superficial cutting as a coping mechanism. The claim is documented with requested specifics, dates, instruments, body regions, witnesses, and any medical treatment. Investigators seek corroboration in medical records where releases permit and in prior photographs if those exist. The purpose isn't to shame, it's to prevent a vague narrative from substituting for measured fact. If past minor self-harm occurred, it must be precisely defined so the crime lab can explain why the subfloor sample in the bedroom, if confirmed as Elizabeth's blood, reflects a volume and vertical travel inconsistent with superficial wounds. That conclusion belongs to the forensic path and serology reports, not to interview notes, but the interview notes establish what must be answered in court. Neighbors are re-interviewed with tighter windows pulled from the digital blackout. One reports lights toggling in a pattern they don't recall from normal evenings. Another mentions a vehicle alignment that didn't match the house's usual habit. The statements are admissible in limited ways and are treated accordingly, as contextual. Patrol officers who responded on October 14th are also recontacted. Body cam footage, when available, is reviewed for what the first responders could see. Door positions, thermostat settings, the presence or absence of cleaning equipment in obvious sight. If a carpet cleaner was visible or later produced as a household item, that is noted. If it was purchased on October 14th, the receipt and store video, addressed next chapter, will clarify whether this was routine or reactive. A small but critical discipline keeps this chapter coherent. Witnesses are not asked to explain the evidence. They're asked to provide words, behaviors, and schedules. One friend remembers a childcare swap that would have required a callback from Elizabeth. It never came. Another notes a plan for a legal consultation that week. There is no confirmation she made it. Those lines aren't turned into conclusions. They are pinned to the timeline so later testimony can either confirm attendance or not. Detectives also check the spouse's later statements against the earlier ones. Minor shifts often occur as people remember or as stress changes. What matters are changes that intersect with hard clocks. The last successful text, the dark interval, the retail timestamp, the camera windows. If a bedtime moves by an hour or a claimed errand appears only after a receipt is mentioned, that is documented as a potential inconsistency to be explored through independent proof. Store video, license plate captures, or device analysis conducted under warrant. Throughout, the tone of interviews is kept neutral. The aim is not confession, the aim is precision. When a witness supplies a time, investigators ask, "What were you looking at when you noted it? A phone, a TV program, a receipt, a clock?" That question, simple as it is, helps align personal memory with verifiable sources. If a person says they called around 10, but the carrier record shows no call at 10 o'clock p.m., that discrepancy becomes a follow-up without accusation. There's a human layer worth acknowledging without drifting into drama. Families under strain say contradictory things. People try to protect children, salvage reputations, and manage fear. A good interview honors that reality while creating a clean record. The file doesn't need perfect people. It needs accurate recollection. By the end of this phase, the statement matrix is built. Elizabeth discussing separation and childcare plans before October 13th, a total communication stop later that night, a spouse's voluntary departure claim that lacks the usual digital signatures, and neighbor observations that point to small deviations inside narrow windows. None of this, taken alone, resolves motive or mechanism, but together it defines what the next chapter must do: match words to receipts and hours to cash registers. With statements pinned to clocks, investigators move to the paper that does not forget: receipts, terminal logs, and surveillance that either validates a transaction or exposes timing that doesn't fit the human story. Retail records confirm a carpet cleaning purchase on October 14th, time-stamped within roughly 24 hours of Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan's last known communications. That single line in a bank ledger is useful only when it is authenticated properly, so detectives work backward from the authorization code to the point-of-sale terminal ID and then to the store's digital video recorder. A custodian of records signs an affidavit identifying the recording system, retention settings, camera field of view, and the chain used to export the footage. The export includes a hash value, so any later argument about editing fails at the first technical hurdle. The clip itself is simple: a checkout lane, a product on the belt, a transaction on the register overlay. Investigators log who is in frame and what is not. No large quantity of supplies, no rental paperwork in that moment, just the item that anchors the timestamp. Conclusive, not by itself, but aligned with a sudden phone blackout and a home that later yields deeper stains beneath a bedroom carpet, the timing becomes a spoke in a wheel that keeps turning in one direction. Additional purchases around that window are pulled by subpoenas. The objective is not volume, it is pattern. If the cardholder bought ordinary groceries, gas, or kids' items, those lines are left in for context. A change in routine, unusual cleaning supplies, protective gear, or cash withdrawals would be flagged, but the record here stays narrow. The store's door camera adds a second angle showing the entry and exit, plus vehicle make and partial plate. Stills are captured with timestamps and scaled. If someone argues the receipt could reflect another person, the video and the terminal ID together answer that without commentary. On the logistics front, detectives retrieve a moving timeline that was already in motion by the time the shoreline identification had occurred, communications about a future relocation in October 2016, property management notes, and quotes that show a household preparing for change. Those items are not incriminating, they are life. But when paired with a homicide designation, they frame where attention should go next: storage and transport resources that might exist off-site. Storage contracts, freezer purchases, or borrowed appliances would be relevant if they appear. When a freezer narrative surfaces in later charging documents as a possible explanation for the delay between injury and Bay deposition, it is explicitly marked as prosecution theory and disputed by the defense. The script does not elevate a theory to fact, it labels it, cites the source, and moves it to the column to be tested at trial. A different paper trail runs through the home itself. Itemized property receipts from the homicide research collected in Chapter 3 are matched to the retail pulls now. If the cleaner brand from the receipt corresponds to residue identified on carpet padding or to an empty container later found during a lawful search, the lab will test whether that chemical signature appears in the flooring layers or is simply incidental to a family's cleaning routine. Jurors respond to that kind of restraint. Show the chemistry, not speculation. Meanwhile, the folding knife taken from the attic is in the queue for trace and DNA comparison. This chapter does not pre-argue those results. It documents how the timing of retail behavior could intersect with a post-injury environment. The social side of procurement is also examined with the same caution. Texts or emails about borrowing a steam cleaner, asking a neighbor for trash space, or scheduling bulky item pickup are reviewed for dates and follow-through. If nothing abnormal appears, that absence is logged as negative evidence. If something new surfaces, it is validated by an independent record: city service logs, private hauler tickets, or HOA security video at dumpsters. In this file, the footprint remains tight: the known receipt, the authenticated video, and routine expenditures that do not move the needle by themselves. Investigators step into a smaller but critical lane: disposal access. The Liberty Station waterfront and adjacent lanes are mapped for cameras that could catch a vehicle late at night leaving or returning within the dark interval plus the next day. Each camera returned earlier with mixed retention. Still, a marina lot provides partial coverage of approaches. No single clip resolves the narrative. That's not how real work looks. Instead, the team builds a best available corridor and notes the blind spots. In towns like this, people assume cameras see everything. They do not. The method is to prove what the clocks and lenses can prove and admit what they cannot. One discipline keeps the file steady, anchoring every inference to a document that a custodian can authenticate in court. The store manager can authenticate the video, the bank can authenticate the transaction, the manufacturer can speak to bottle volume and typical household use. A detective can narrate none of that from memory at trial. The point is to collect witnesses who can. That is how a crime report becomes a case that survives motion practice. There's a human cost under the paperwork. Paper trails tell you where someone went and what they paid for. They don't tell you why a family's routines went silent. The narrative voice here respects that gap. We do not claim emotional certainty, where the record provides only hours and items. What we do claim is that hours and items, properly authenticated, are the parts a jury is allowed to hear. By the end of this phase, the procurement board shows a small but durable structure. A cleaning product purchase inside the first day after the blackout, authenticated by terminal ID and video. Ordinary spending that neither excuses nor explains the timing. Move prep documents from 2016 that belong to life but help locate off-site storage. And a marked box in the theory column, freezer storage, clearly labeled as the state's interpretation and the defense's dispute. The board is not a conclusion. It is the staging ground for warrants, probable cause, and interagency handoffs. With hours, purchases, and scene samples aligned, the file shifts from collection to decision. Prosecutors sit with detectives and walk through the elements required for a homicide filing, cause and manner established by the medical examiner, evidence of an assault location, post-event behavior inconsistent with accident or self-harm, and a timeline that closes voluntary explanations. The state does not need every lab report in hand to draft probable cause, but it does need a coherent theory that rests on records, not guesses. Here, the working theory is narrow. Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan suffered sharp force injuries inside the Liberty Station residence. Later that evening, her phone activity ceased and never resumed. And within about a day, a carpet cleaning product was purchased that aligns with a flooring cut, revealing a downward blood path. Statements that she left are tested against the blackout and the absence of the usual markers of voluntary flight. Each component is cited to an exhibit number, so the affidavit reads like a map rather than a story. Warrant language is written in the present tense that judges expect: what is known, how it is known, and what is sought. The search requests are staged, not sweeping, device imaging under separate authority, any off-site storage records narrowed by dates, and a targeted pull of marina-adjacent cameras already identified. The affidavit flags that a folding knife was recovered from the attic in sealed condition, its testing pending. It does not claim results that do not yet exist, it marks them as forthcoming. That restraint builds credibility when a magistrate weighs the nexus between the home, the injuries, and the timing. Once a judge signs, the homicide detail coordinates with the district attorney's office on a parallel arrest warrant. The charging theory, ultimately filed as murder, describes conduct, not character. Marital strain appears only as context to explain access and opportunity, not as motive proof. The defense's early suggestion of prior superficial cutting is acknowledged in a single sentence as a claim to be addressed by medical evidence, not by lay opinion. That balance is deliberate. A clean charging document survives better in front of juries and during motions to dismiss. Interagency steps begin immediately. The arrest warrant and a wanted person entry are transmitted through the National Crime Information Center and to the U.S. Marshals-led Fugitive Task Force. San Diego coordinates with allied agencies on potential out-of-state whereabouts. When a subject is believed to be in Delaware, liaison calls are made to local police and the marshals in that district. The packet sent across state lines is complete: certified warrant, probable cause narrative, photographs, descriptive identifiers, and any caution notes relevant to a safe arrest. The goal is custody without incident. When the fugitive team executes the warrant, the procedural details are methodical: perimeter units, knock and announce, and a quick controlled entry. An arrest without injury helps a jury focus on the crime, not on the arrest. At booking, standard fingerprints and photographs are taken, identifiers are confirmed, and a hold is placed for extradition to California. Any spontaneous statements are documented verbatim with time, place, and witnesses. There is no interrogation in this chapter because this chapter is about moving a person legally, not debating facts in a hallway. Extradition is a paper process built to withstand challenge. If the arrestee waives extradition, transport can be arranged promptly. If not, California submits a governor's requisition, and Delaware conducts a hearing limited to identity and the validity of the papers, not guilt. Either way, the receiving agency prepares the chain: travel arrangements, escorting officers, property inventory, and a medical screening. The transport log captures time of pickup, route, any stops, and time of delivery to San Diego. That log becomes part of the court file to preempt later claims about improper handling. Back in San Diego, the first appearance is calendared. Bail is argued with reference to the factors the law allows. Seriousness of the offense, weight of the evidence at that stage, ties to the community, and risk of flight. The prosecutor references the network silence after October 13th, the scene findings from the flooring cuts, the authenticated retail timestamp on October 14th, the knife recovery, and the absence of any voluntary flight markers by the victim. The defense emphasizes community ties, employment history, and the lack, at that point, of complete lab results. It may also reiterate the superficial cutting claim as an alternative cause of blood in a residence. The judge sets conditions with an eye toward public safety and appearance. Flight risk is not argued with adjectives, it is argued with records. Behind the scenes, discovery obligations start moving. The state discloses what it has and notes what is pending. Serology results on the subfloor sample, DNA work on the attic knife, any additional camera exports, and certified financial records. A protective order may be sought to shield children's identities and personal addresses. The defense files routine discovery requests and preservation notices. None of this makes headlines. All of it sustains the integrity of the prosecution. The probable cause hearing, if held, is not a mini-trial, it is a checkpoint. A detective summarizes the timeline, last known communications later that evening, immediate and sustained phone blackout, purchase within about a day, home reprocessing with a downward blood path, and the morgue findings of sharp force injuries, each tied to authenticated records and photographs. The court's task is limited. Determine whether a reasonable person could believe a crime occurred and the named person committed it. The answer moves the matter into the longer arc toward trial. At this stage, it's worth naming one discipline that protects the whole. Prosecutors keep theories in the theory box and facts in the fact box. For example, any freezer storage narrative remains clearly labeled as the state's interpretation and disputed by the defense. It appears only to justify subsequent warrants, not as a concluded fact. The charging papers never substitute a theory for a measurement. Jurors later will decide which inferences the facts support. Public communication is minimal and careful. Agencies confirm the arrest, the booking location, and the basic charges. They do not argue the case in the media. They protect the record. Families are notified, victim services are offered, and the court schedule is posted. In towns like this, the quiet work is the durable work. You can see it in the clerk's stamps and the chain of custody seals more than in any press release. From a human vantage, the interagency chain is how a local file becomes a courtroom file. Detectives who walked Liberty Station floors hand their measured work to lawyers and marshals who move people and papers across borders. Also, a jury of residents can weigh certified evidence rather than rumor. It's the unglamorous center of every serious crime prosecution in the United States. By the close of this chapter, the structure is set. Arrest warrant issued, out-of-state custody achieved with U.S. and Marshals coordination, extradition completed, first appearance held, discovery rolling, and the theory of homicide tied to authenticated timestamps and physical findings without overclaiming what labs have not yet reported. The next move belongs to motion practice and admissibility, what the jury will be allowed to see and what must stay out. With custody secured and discovery flowing, the file moves from collection to courtroom. Pre-trial is where the borders get drawn, what the jury will hear and what stays out. The first hearings deal with admissibility and scope. The defense challenges the seizure and testing of items from the Liberty Station residence, including the bedroom flooring cuts and the folding knife recovered from the attic. Prosecutors answer with clean paperwork. The warrant affidavit built on the fixed digital blackout after October 13th, the authenticated October 14th retail timestamp, and the documented reprocessing of the home with scene logs and chain of custody seals. The court rules that investigators had a particularized basis and that the methods used, sealing, logging, and lab submission, satisfy foundational reliability. The knife and the flooring specimens are in, subject to experts establishing relevance at trial. Next comes the carrier data. Defense counsel questions whether phone network records could mislead a jury about presence versus activity. The court permits the records with a limiting instruction. Analysts may explain what the network can show, connections, message attempts, inactivity windows, and what it cannot. Precise location without corroborating sources. That instruction protects both sides and preserves the report's value. After a certain hour on October 13th, Elizabeth Michelle Sullivan's communications never resume. Bail is argued and set with reference to statutory factors. Prosecutors point to the homicide designation by the medical examiner, the scene findings beneath the bedroom carpet, the October 14th purchase anchored by point-of-sale video, and the absence of any voluntary departure markers by the victim. The defense cites community ties and the lack, at that point, of every final lab result. The court sets conditions that prioritize appearance and public safety. With the procedural boundaries drawn, the matter is set for trial. Jury selection is functional and quiet. Potential jurors are told they will hear forensic testimony that includes decomposition limitations, DNA comparisons, and digital records. They are screened for attitudes about circumstantial evidence. The panel seated is instructed that circumstantial and direct evidence carry equal weight when each satisfies the same standard. Opening statements match the tone of the record. The state lays out a linear theory. Elizabeth suffered sharp force injuries inside her residence. Her phone fell silent later that evening. Within about a day, a cleaning product was purchased. Flooring cuts show a downward blood path beneath a bedroom carpet, and a folding knife from the attic is introduced through expert testimony. The defense asks jurors to withhold judgment, proposes alternative explanations for blood in a home where a family lived, and emphasizes that the Bay's environment complicates exact reconstruction. The medical examiner testifies first. The pathologist explains that despite marine exposure, there is evidence of sharp force trauma consistent with multiple stab wounds and associated skeletal injuries. Manner is listed as homicide. The expert is careful about limits. Exact time of death cannot be fixed to an hour, and water conditions affect soft tissue findings. That restraint builds credibility. On cross, the pathologist confirms the limits and reiterates that nothing observed supports accident or self-inflicted death in that setting. Forensic serology and DNA follow. A criminalist walks jurors through the collection protocol. The carpet section removed, padding lifted, and subfloor sampled with photographed grids and controls. The lab report is introduced through the analyst who did the work. Results: a DNA profile matching Elizabeth is confirmed in subfloor samples taken from beneath the bedroom carpet. The report addresses contamination safeguards and lab audits. On cross, the defense presses household use scenarios and historic cuts. The analyst answers with volumes, vertical travel, and dilution patterns that do not align with incidental contact or superficial injury. The folding knife is then presented. A property technician authenticates the sealed recovery from the attic, the booking in evidence, and the transfer to the lab. The DNA analyst testifies to partial profiles and statistics within the limits of mixed samples. The state does not overclaim. It explains what is detected, what is not, and how probability ratios are calculated. Jurors hear that the knife is consistent with the mechanism described by the pathologist. They are not told that it is the only possible weapon. That precision preserves the credibility of the exhibit. Digital evidence is kept inside its lane. A carrier representative explains call and text logs, timestamps, and the absence of outgoing or incoming activity after a specified evening hour. A detective overlays those times against camera windows gathered near the residence and against authenticated retail transactions from October 14th. The point-of-sale video is admitted through a custodian who certifies the system, retention policies, and export hash values. The clip shows a checkout with the cleaning product. The exact item, register overlay, and time code are visible. The witness identifies what the video can establish and stops there. The prosecutor does not argue emotion. The prosecutor argues alignment. Witnesses from Elizabeth's circle provide context. Friends testify that she discussed separation steps and childcare logistics, not a plan to disappear. A neighbor describes lights toggling atypically within a narrow window and a vehicle alignment that seemed off habit. The court instructs the jury on the limited weight of such observations. The spouse's early statement, that Elizabeth left, is introduced as a statement to law enforcement and then tested against the fixed clocks. The absence of follow-up activity from Elizabeth is presented without editorializing. The defense presents its narrative, that Elizabeth struggled at times, that blood in a family home can have innocent explanations, and that gaps in shoreline cameras and decomposition limit certainty. Where appropriate, the defense raises an alternative view of timing. Prosecutors answer not with adjectives, but with records, chain of custody seals, lab worksheets, network logs, and the narrow timing of post-event purchases. The freezer storage hypothesis appears only as prosecution theory, expressly disputed by the defense, and is treated as an inference for jurors to accept or reject based on admitted evidence. The judge reinforces those boundaries before deliberations. Closing arguments reflect the file's structure. The state assembles the pieces in the order jurors saw them: homicide finding, the bedroom's downward blood path, the attic knife and its testing, the phone's sudden and permanent silence, and the authenticated purchase that lines up with post-injury cleanup behavior. The defense urges reasonable doubt, asking jurors to see ordinary life in the receipts and to view the Bay's effect on remains as a deficit the state cannot overcome. The final instructions specify the elements for second-degree murder and remind jurors that motive is not required if conduct satisfies the elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Deliberations are measured. The verdict returns in 2021. Guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing follows California law for the offense, 16 years to life. The court orders credits and imposes mandatory terms. No second ending exists. There is one outcome, grounded in authenticated records and expert testimony. There is a human sentence outside the legal one. 2 children lost their mother. A community that watched a long, quiet investigation learned what genuine forensic work looks like: slow, respectful, and focused on proof that lasts. Domestic violence can be invisible until it is not. If you or someone you know is in danger, reach out, early and often. Silence is not absence. Sometimes it is evidence that a crime has already happened. Guilty, sentenced to 16 years to life. As I look back on Elizabeth Sullivan's story, I can't help but think about how easily red flags can be missed until tragedy strikes. No one ever expects violence to unfold behind closed doors, but this crime is a stark reminder that silence is not safety. If there's one lesson here, it's that seeking help early can save lives. I share this not just as a narrator, but as someone hoping you take something away for your own family, your neighbors, your community. What do you think was the most powerful turning point? Was it the evidence beneath the carpet or the silence of Elizabeth's phone? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or share how stories like this connect with your own experiences. And if this video resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case we uncover together. Your voice, your perspective, and your support keep these stories alive.